as of this summer, I'll have been practicing architecture for 30 years, which means I can finally call myself a young architect. And it's a good moment for me to look back on the panorama of our work and start to distill certain underlying trends. And so I'm going to organize this talk around, actually let me cue this up. Great. Around three ideas. The first one was already quite eloquently addressed, which is, for me, architecture needs to have an agenda. Right? It has to do something. And that's not that I have any criticism of beauty and aesthetics. It's very important to me. It's very important to our firm. But if it isn't doing something more, for me, it's not satisfying. That's just my take. I will say that when looking back at our work, I would say 70% of that doing has to do with inventing and reimagining ways of addressing flexibility. The second, I think I can best summarize by this ad from a 1990s film. They're boxy, but they're good. I am also slightly awkward with form. I don't feel good about it. I love Mies, I love Gordon Bunshaft. Our work has always had this kind of boxy attitude to it. And I will say that it wasn't until about 10 years ago that I realized that it wasn't just a predilection, but it was a strategy. And what I mean by that is, by doing buildings that are simple and Cartesian, it greatly reduces the numbers of facade systems. That allows us to push the limit, push the envelope, pun intended, on those facade systems, to take the money that we have, not ask for more money, but to do much more ambitious things within them. And the result is not only facade systems that I think are innovative and elegant, but they do something else. They start to add some quotient of, for lack of a better way of saying it, phenomena. And so the second idea is a commitment to phenomena over form. And then the third is baked into our name, Rex. It really comes from the idea of redo, reopen, rethink. I have a critique of our profession, which is that if an architect evolves an aesthetic language, we somehow have no problem with that over a course of a lifetime. But if an architect reuses ideas that are performative, you start to hear people say, oh, they've done that before. They're a one-trick pony. I don't get that. I don't understand why we do that. You can win the Nobel Prize for taking someone else's idea and evolving it. And yet, in our professions, they're somehow considered suspect. So through this lecture, I am going to unabashedly show how one idea led into the next. And so just to start, there are two projects that we're doing right now that I don't know how to subsume within the rest of the lecture, so I'm going to start with them to show this point. And the first one is a project we're finishing in Brisbane. It has a very simple idea. It is absolutely a kind of Miesian Cartesian project. Its one main idea was an observation that within the really harsh Brisbane sun, that we could actually cut out more sunlight using basically what geometrically is an oval extrusion with far less material. And that could allow us to drive the glass to being almost completely transparent in a market where that doesn't exist. Right? That was the main idea. But you can see this is a great example of phenomena over form, phenomenology over form. Right? It makes something that's actually quite spectacular while being highly, highly performative. At the tail end of the design of that project, we started working on a pair of residential towers that are now under construction on the Brooklyn waterfront. And you can see the ovals kind of came back. So this is an example where, again, I'm unabashedly, this is an aesthetic predilection that we've been sort of obsessing with, which is the oval and how its repetition creates some really remarkably beautiful things. But again, it's performative. In this project, we were working with an existing envelope, a ULURP, and it created two parallel towers, and we had to build within those two parallel towers. The problem is that those towers, the main view was along the main axis. In the competition, the developer asked us to basically cover the building in balconies. The reason that was a problem that needed to be solved is that normally you do that in order to protect view from one unit into the next, you have to put a screen divider. That screen divider then would, in this case, block the main view. So you'd build over 1,000 units in Brooklyn looking at Manhattan and block the view to Manhattan. And the observation was if we could take the balcony and cut an oval cut into the balcony, several things happen. The first is as a person moves along the sinusoidal balcony front, the guardrail, as they get to the next unit, they're forced into the window wall and they can't actually see into the neighbor's unit. So we could remove the demising wall between them and the divider between them. But the other is that in New York we have really, really stringent watershed laws. And this allows us to take all the water that's on this building and actually maintain it within the system, within the footprint of the building, and it cascades down within the building without ever falling onto an adjacent balcony or a unit. It has another interesting advantage. Two things here is that when you're standing on a balcony, you always have an aperture above you, and so you get a double height space. You don't feel that kind of claustrophobic pressure of being under an element, horizontal element above you. And the sinusoidal balcony becomes highly reflective because of the geometry, and it covers all the detritus that normally makes buildings with balconies really unpleasant, right? It covers the bicycle, and they store their extra chairs out there, and all that begins to be hidden by the reflective nature of it. As I said, this is started construction, just to show you some of the mock-ups of where it's at this point. Okay. The main thrust of the lecture is I want to talk about flexibility and really rethinking flexibility. And what I want to do is try and talk about 4 different ideas of flexibility that have come out over the course of that 30 years. And I'm going to try and show each one by talking about 2 different projects to illustrate how this idea actually has legs. What I want to say from the outset is, as a critique of our profession, I think that we have been recycling in a negative way, kind of blindly, the high modernist notion of flexibility. Right? The tabula rasa, the blank slate on which or in which you can do anything. Right? This idea, you throw enough money and manpower at it, you can do anything. And what we know is that that doesn't work very well because we don't have money and we don't have manpower. And so, if you look at the visual arts, that is expressed as the white cube, the performing arts, that's the black box. What we know about all these projects, not just within the arts, but really the whole spectrum of architecture, is that it basically creates really sterile architecture, and that sterile architecture doesn't support its reconfiguration, ironically. So I want you to think about a different way of imagining flexibility that was really proffered by Noguchi, and it's what he called playscapes. I don't know if you know these, but they're really spectacular. They are kind of free-form playgrounds, and his thinking was, if I give a kid a swing, he can pretty much just swing and kind of do a little bit of else. And if I give him a blank field, he'll come up with some games. But if I give him this topography, this geometry that begs the child to imagine and invent and play, that becomes a much more profitable environment. I don't mean economic. I mean in terms of their sparking imagination than a blank slate. So keep that in mind. That would be kind of the underlying current. And effectively, can specificity be conceived as the new form of flexibility, which is a bit ironic. And I can't talk about this without going back to my absolute roots. First project that I ever led, the Seattle Central Library. By the way, if anyone who looks at this and says, oh, but that's not a dumb box, I'll remind you that it's actually just 5 dumb boxes stacked on top of each other. When we started this project, and this was when I was a partner at OMA, in 1999, public libraries were confronted with 2 simultaneous explosions. One had to do with media, and one had to do with social responsibility. And for the most part, architects at that time didn't really know how to deal with this simultaneous explosion. And they were doing beautiful buildings. This isn't, if you know what this is, it's not to slag this building off, it's a wonderful building. But you can see that it's very generic on the inside, right? The reading room looked like the magazine collection, looked like the children's collection, because they really didn't know how to deal with its evolution. And the proposal of the Seattle Library was, let's divide the program into really discrete platforms, these boxes that are stacked on top of each other, and let's solve only one thing in each box and have its own structure, its own mechanical system, its own circulation, its own material palette, and its own form of evolution. And tie them together with this in-between continuous space that, yes, may be sort of universally flexible, but at least has very specific architectural environment. And so there you see the 5 dumb boxes on the left and the continuous public sort of trajectory that runs up between them. And if I just go from bottom to top of the building, you see the kind of radically different experiences that you have within a single building. It's almost an urban, sort of internalizing an urban condition. And then to illustrate the power of this idea of specificity, let me talk about just these 2 elements, the book spiral and the mixing chamber. 1999, we didn't have these, but there were a lot of smart people in Seattle who were predicting things like this. point blank, what happens when you can access information from anywhere? Why would you need a central library? Why would you spend $118 million of public money to do it? And our answer eventually, in deep conversation with the library board, the staff, and so forth, are the librarians. Right? When information can be accessed anywhere, and at this moment we know this better than at any other moment in human history, it's the curation of information that makes information valuable. So they actually become the main asset to the library. The problem is that historically libraries were not organized around the librarian, they were organized around the materials. And so you can see how the librarians are sort of spread out in little fiefdoms, and to refine a search, you kind of shunt it all over the place. And what we wanted to do is create this central zone in which all the librarians could dogpile you at once. We could get all of their intelligence and have them help you refine your search. In order to do that, we had to get them out of the stacks, and that meant we had to solve this problem. Stacks are really, really generally confusing. They don't make any sense. I don't know what the difference is between literature and nonfiction. If someone knows, let me know. But there's two different sections of the library. I don't know why one is in one and one is not the other. And the result was the book spiral. Right? Just organize the books on a continuous parking structure, so it's dumb, right? Unlike cars that burn books as much as we've tried to over history, they don't really burn particularly well. So you can put them on a continuous spiral inside a library. If you can do it with books, you can do it, cars, you can do it with books. But books just reorganize on that spiral as the collections grow and expand in certain areas and contract, and just through regular reshelving, it just reoccupies itself on that continuous loop. There you see it under construction. It is literally just a parking garage. And then the navigation is just done in the system itself. You get into the system, you go up, the numbers go up, you go down, the numbers go down. So it's intuitive. Therefore, librarians are no longer forced to be docents, helping you find something. You even get into the elevator, and if your call number is 141.142, you just push the button, the elevator door opens, and you're in the system near where your book is. And that allowed us to create this, right? This kind of mixing chamber of ideas where all of these people who, most people don't know, but most public librarians have PhDs, and their intelligence is wasted. So this allows them to be concentrated in one place. All right, so that idea led to a notion, the first of the 5 different ideas about flexibility I want to talk about, we call divide and conquer. So let me give an illustration of how divide and conquer could be used in a wildly different typology. You know what this building is. I will tell you that as simple as this building looks, and it has offices in the lower half and it has residences on the upper half, that simple geometry does violence to its program. Why? Because both officing and residential, the dimension from window wall to core is really, really specific in order to lay the building out well. That means there are 2 good floors on that building and the rest are terrible. But it looks so simple, it looks so rational, how could it be wrong? I've just told you, it does violence to the program. So this is a project that we have under construction, and I'll show you in a moment. We've just finished the lower tower. It's a mixed-use tower, and it addresses this idea of divide and conquer. Perth is trying to build out down towards the waterfront from the CBD. They have allowed the development of this whole thing called Elizabeth Quay. Ooh, I can't really do this. Okay, I'll try. I will not do that. But now I got to get that. Perfect. What was strange about the master plan is that every one of these towers is basically the same. They're all mixed use in the same way, offices, residential, hotel. Programmatically, they all had a plinth and tower, and we're the last ones coming along. And our general reaction was the amenities that are normally at the plinth of a building like this are not particularly good at making good cities. Right? A ballroom doesn't get used that often. You put a ballroom at grade, it doesn't really activate the cityscape. You put a gym or a 3-meal restaurant, again, it's not creating activity. So our first proposal before I get to divide and conquer was just a kind of simple idea of take all of that stuff, that amenity stuff, and put it up into that plus that you see on the left side. And that enabled us to create real dynamic, full-on retail at the base of the building. But now to divide and conquer. The 2 lower blocks are offices. The upper block is a combination of hotel and residential. The hotelier that we're working with, that actually worked quite well geometrically. And we just told the client, you tell us exactly the proportions you want. and we will tweak it constantly. If the elevator gets bigger, the core, et cetera, et cetera. So it's just constantly tweaking on the most optimum dimension. And it's the constellation of these things that becomes the architectural expression. That meant that from a development standpoint, the building could fluctuate. Full disclosure, as you can tell, I'm not a big fan of parametric architecture in terms of making shapes. I think that this is an intelligent way to do parametric architecture. We wrote a script. Client comes to us and says, you know what, the housing market's getting weaker. I need 27 fewer residences. We type it in, the drawing set changes in a millisecond, we're done, we move on. Same thing, I need 10 more keys in the hotel. Again, the building just simply fluctuates, and it fluctuates up until about 3 months before we will start construction on the larger tower, because that's the amount of time it will take us to go to the wind tunnel test, get the information, finish the design of the foundations, and move forward. So when we actually presented this in the competition, this is what we showed them. We said, look, I don't know what the ultimate building is. And we happened to know, given who our competitors were, that they were going to do a shape. And in fact, amongst the 5 firms competing, we were the only one who took this strategy. Everyone else did a shape that couldn't actually fluctuate. And these projects, when they're this big, they die on the vine because the economic model changes over the life of the design. This doesn't. However, there's another advantage, which is by taking all the complexity and sticking it up into the middle of the building, we could also advance the construction documents for about 95% of the project way faster than if we had all that complexity at the base of the building. It required you to resolve it now. We basically said, we'll come back later. We will resolve the elevatoring and the structure and the envelope and everything else we need to, and we'll come back and we'll mess with that stuff in the middle. It's also a bit divide and conquer. You can see how there are 4 arms, and each arm is programmatically very, very distinct. The architecture very, very distinct. What was interesting is that when we finally got to designing these things, no one cared what we did, because they knew that we could only push the cost of the project off by about 1%, no matter how bonkers we went. So we went bonkers, right? No resistance. And I'll come back to, and the last thing I'll say is that counter to what you might think, that idea of the plus was also performative. Why? Because we build the plus at grade, we put all of the complex mechanical systems into it, we jack it up in one day using the same kind of lift jack technology that they build aircraft hangars out of, and then they start staging the construction from 2 points. We shave 2 months off the construction. So I promise you that whenever the contractor said, I can save you money by reducing those cantilevers, the owner said, don't you touch them, right? Because from their standpoint, that is serious money for them to save, not to expend. There you see the project from grade, and then this is where it is currently. We've just topped out and finished the smaller of the two, and we'll start construction on the larger momentarily. Okay, that's divide and conquer, and just to give you an idea how this has legs, this is a project in Mexico City, which if I were to x-ray it, you can see the kind of DNA of the previous one still actually getting played out in yet another iteration. Okay, second idea, presets. This one absolutely comes from the ideas and evolutions of this project. The notion of presets is this. If you think of this being a diagram of universal flexibility, right? On that arrow, you can do anything. What typically happens, and the great example was the Arts District Theater that preceded the Wyly Theatre, is at some point they build something into it, and it costs too much to do really radical things, and so they might move it off center. So this thing that seems to have wild flexibility actually is wildly not flexible. The idea of presets is, what if we build very specific things along that spectrum? And we know exactly how much time, money, labor it will take to go between each one of them. And we know that each one of them is designed very specifically to have exceptional acoustics, intimacies, and sight lines. And if you do it right, our supposition was, they'll also move those things off center. And you see that all of a sudden this thing that seems like just a lot of specificity starts to cover the complete spectrum that you thought you were going to get if you built a black box. That's the idea of presets. And I'm going to show a project. It's actually the final of the 3 performing arts centers we've done. And then I'll show the one that we started in between this and the Wyly Theatre. This is a performing arts center for Brown. It's important to say it's a performing arts center, not a theater. So, and the problem with these typologies is that when they try to do all kinds of things, they tend to do a lot good and nothing great, and that wasn't going to fly here. So we had to somehow crack that code and make something that was exceptional in each configuration. Brown wanted a building that would allow them to become the Arts Ivy. Right? They created something called the Arts Institute. This idea is centered around the notion that the arts should infect every other intellectual pursuit, and conversely, all the other intellectual pursuits should be infecting the arts. So you should have a applied and computational mathematics student working with a dancer. You should have a chemist working with a cellist, and so forth. That's the kind of thing that they want the institute to do, and they wanted the building to promote that. And we did it through two means. One was its flexibility, and the other, which I'll speak about in a second, was this notion of this like clear story that cut through the whole building, so that at all times the campus writ large could actually move through the building and see the work that's going on stage. But let's go back and talk about the idea of doing a lot good and nothing exceptional. These are actually performance images, but when we started, Brown assumed, which was a fair assumption, they asked us to do a symphony orchestra space for a 105-piece symphony and 80-person chorus, and a multimedia space, experimental media. And they assumed it was not possible, and again for good reason, to have a space within that could also do theater and small ensemble work. Now there's one really bizarre thing about Providence and Brown, which allowed us to do what had heretofore never been done, the Holy Grail, which is to do one building that can do all these configurations. Before I show it, I'll also say that it enabled us to also do a big flat floor environment, so they could do large format art, as well as just use it for banquets and other things within the Brown community. So let me show you the 5 presets: experimental media, recital, end stage, orchestra, flat floor. The observation was Brown Symphony Orchestra, which is effectively Providence's symphony, typically only performs for about 500 people. Symphony orchestra spaces traditionally are 1,800 to 2,200 seats, and the way that they deal with large acoustic volume you need for an orchestra actually is accommodated through the seating. If you actually have, and so that large volume of seating then is very difficult to shut that down for things like small ensemble and experimental media or theater. So they're just at odds. Because we were dealing with such a small number of audience members, we could actually get the base dimension of the auditorium small enough that you could actually contract and expand the dimension of the auditorium, and take all that volume and stick it vertically. And the advantage of that is now you effectively have a building that has effectively a massive fly tower smeared out over all of the auditorium and the stage at once. And that's why the building has this kind of unusual stovepipe hat expression, where you have like a brim that has got a really tall centerpiece, is we're trying to hold on to all that acoustic volume for the symphony orchestra. So let me go through the different configurations. Just to talk about the evolution of this from the Wyly, the difference is that this is actually almost fully automated. You push a button and the building transforms, volumetrically, acoustically, everything. So this is its inert state, and going to the mixed media, see the back wall comes in, ceiling comes down, side walls come in, flat floor. The next configuration, back wall goes out, all of the side walls come in, and the floor rakes, the ceiling comes down quite low, and that's recital configuration. Now, 2 of the side walls open to create side stages. Really don't need much acoustic quality in the ceiling for the theatrical configuration. And then moving to the symphony orchestra, basically everything moves out. The ceiling takes a large geometry that's the biggest rake. And then finally, the flat floor configuration. And I say it's fully automated. It's also controlled by, here, let me show the story. It has what's called a NISCON system, which means that it's, in terms of life safety, it's fully automated. There are lasers. If someone were to put their hand between 2 operating things, the building will shut down. If you forget to put one of the balustrades in and someone could fall to their death, again, the building won't move. Sirens will go off. So it's automated not just only in its mobility, but also in its life safety. I think the most interesting thing is what you just saw last, is how the ceiling converts its acoustic volume. And I'll talk about that in a second. Just like the Wyly, I will say, if you're going to do a building that moves, dare to be dumb. Only used known fully warranted technologies. You might be borrowing it from other spheres of influence. The building is effectively a big bridge. The movable balcony elements were built on shoring in the middle. And once they were suspended, we then took the temporary shoring out and they hung from that large bridge. So you can see it's sort of two bridge abutments on the top and the bottom of the photo. The balconies move on dumb gantries from the shipping industry. To make the egress connections when the balconies move in and out. These are extensor arms from the backs of fire trucks. Fire trucks, as you can imagine, if they break, that's a huge problem for some people at certain moments. So we're very certain that they will not break. And then this, which was, we borrowed technology from Skycam technology, which you know from the Super Bowl and from the US Open. Right, you see those cameras flying around the space and they are completely soundless. How do we know? Because if the camera was moving while Alcatraz was serving, Alcaraz, it's close, it would be a significant problem. So they are completely soundless and they're totally warranted. If you were to drop a camera and kill 40 people during the Super Bowl, you can imagine the negative repercussions of that. And so that allows me to come to this image, which was the most, probably the most exciting moment I've ever had as an architect. Opening night, Itzhak Perelman. He had come to rehearse in the building the night before. He was doing a piece that really only a virtuoso can play. And he said, you know, historically, I've always not enjoyed this piece because if the environment is good for the symphony, by the time I come and play, you can't really hear me, and if you can hear me, I get blown out in the later stages when I'm not in the credenza and I'm playing with the symphony. So we changed the ceiling during the performance. It dropped in about 3/4 of a second. We had to tell everyone in the audience, it's going to terrify you. They all knew. They still gasped when it happened, but the ceiling just went like this. And literally as he started this really, it's like a 3.5 minute credenza, all of a sudden you could hear his fingers moving on the frets, you could hear him breathing. And afterwards he said, I felt like I was playing the building. Nicest compliment I've ever received. And then I talked about this cut that goes through the building that allows literally the campus to engage what's going on stage. This is an exterior portion of the building that they can do exterior performances. This is the lobby with a light installation that we integrated into it. But you can see the kind of hyper transparency. This is the one part that you can't have transparency, which is the sound and light locks, so we just put it in mirror. And then the main hall, which I think is probably the best. This is probably the best image of the whole project. It gives the spirit of the whole idea. And there you see what happens is all day long. The campus watches what's happening. Of course, they can black it out because sometimes the creation of art is intimate and you feel exposed, and so they can control it. Absolutely must be able to do that. And then the last thing I'll say is that there was this weird predilection for, just as I was showing ovals, we went through a whole fluting phase. And so here's fluting on another project. Fluting, in this case, was fluting glass. This is for a project in Washington, D.C. It has one idea. You can see that basically it has one idea and it's got like 4 different details. A field condition, a corner condition, a bottom, a top, and the moment over on the far left, which is touching another building. But that's pretty much the entirety of all the details. The glass is all exactly the same dimension. What we were asked to do is to create a new standard for Class A office space in Washington, D.C. In Washington, D.C., you have to build to the lot line because it's so sort of, the amount of real estate you can get is really minimal. So people just build to the height and to the lot line. You are allowed to go over the lot line by 4 inches if you do what's called an appurtenance. And this idea of curving the glass came out of 2 ideas. One is you curve the glass, you increase its moment of inertia, you can therefore make the glass thinner, and it can be self-structured so you don't have mullions. right? So all of a sudden the glass is thin and there's nothing blocking your horizontal view. Right, so this is, I think, part of my favorite photo because it looks a lot like the Miesian drawings of his glass tower. But this is what it looks like in the interior. Right? So it's a much more transparent environment. But the other advantage was kind of how we sold it in the competition. It was for Tishman Speyer, and the gentleman we were doing the competition is a friend, and he's fantastic. And I know his psychology, and we said, well, we curve the glass, we can actually curve the glass over the property line by 4 inches. So the property line, let's see if I can do this now, it's sitting right there at the kind of the inner nose, that's the property line. So we got just about 423 extra square feet over the entire building. And he's so excited about it, he just stuck it to the man, because he got another 423 square feet that most people can't get. And then to offset the kind of crystalline nature of the building, its coldness, we pushed the lobby to be about as warm as we possibly could do. And we ultimately wrapped it in, like I love mahogany, it's mahogany. I have a fetish with wooden boats, so it's wooden boat. And this is a Persian onyx that was incredibly beautiful. And you see it's how these materials kind of play out. I always show this just to say, hey, we care about detailing. And that's a good segue to talk about the other project that we got obsessed with, marble. And it's funny, I found the Persian onyx when I was looking for the marble for this project. This project, we looked at 33 quarries worldwide. Finally found the one that we did. It's the Perelman Performing Arts Center, the World Trade Center. It's sitting all of 50 feet from the memorial. As a New Yorker, it's a very charged memory for me. We felt that in this context, we had to do something that was very simple, pure, and elegant to be respectful of the memorial. And so therefore, we cloaked the building in stone. What most people don't know is that we had to cloak it because we're not allowed to see any kind of commercial activity from the memorial. So you couldn't see the lobby, ticket sales, restaurant, intermission. None of that could be seen from the main vantage point of the building. Therefore, it already forced us into a kind of cloaking idea. By cloaking it with thin stone that was laminated into a glass, then we could allow the building to have a kind of respectful independence at night when it was in operation. And it has another advantage that we know from the Wyly, which is because you allow light to come into the building, it allows you to have people who are creatives who are working this building for 14, 16 hours a day, not to be in a hermetically sealed box, right? They see daylight, and the daylight goes all the way to the center of the chamber. So in thinking about the project, I have to say that a really key aspect, I just denuded it, is what its mission was. Its mission is to produce and co-produce original work. And that's important because it meant that we had to use, conceive of a building that was responsive to the art, not the art being responsive to the building. And it meant that we were really creating auditoria that were very small, because when you're doing original work, people don't know the work. At the heart of the building then is a system. Nominally, you could say it's 3 auditoria, but that's really a naming convention. It was so we could get donors. It was so that when we were building the building, we could refer to stuff. I say that because those 3 nominal auditoria are separated by 42-ton acoustic guillotine walls, and those guillotine walls, that's not a sped up, that's actually the real speed. They allow, create a STC 57 enclosure. That means that you could basically go up to like 140 decibels, which would blow your eardrums out in one space, and you could do spoken word in the next, and there'd be no sound bleed. And that means that these auditoria can expand and then combine with an adjacent into 10 possible proportions. And then within those 10 possible proportions, we come up with different configurations. So the floor is fully automated, creating different geometries. This is a little bit sped up, but it's not that much sped up. You can see how quickly it reconfigures. Balconies can be moved on air casters. All of the gridirons are demountable, so you can adjust the height of the ceilings in the different spaces. And then we have a suite of basically risers and seat systems that they can build almost any kind of configuration in. And so what that means is that within this system, we don't have one theater, but actually we currently already have 65 different stage audience configurations that we have fully taken through the fire department, the building department, and so forth. At some point, another lecture, I'll talk about how we deal with acoustic and life safety in that environment. That was a whole different discussion. This is an advancement from the Wyly in a different way. The Wyly and the Lindemann are multi-form. This is multi-form, but it's also multi-processional. That whole zone, the cruciform in the center and the perimeter, can be defined as front of house or back of house. So this is its kind of base state. You circulate around the perimeter. The central cruciform is back of house. This is, if you have bicameral, 2 shows, maybe one starts at 7, one starts at 7:30. They did this for the Tribeca Film Festival. They made a lobby through the center, and they had 3 concurrent movies going. This is my favorite, kind of Wagnerian, like Bayreuth, where everyone encircles the chamber and just comes in from every side. And then any combination and permutation that you can imagine between theater configuration, art form, and circulation, both during load in and intermission and load out. This is obviously sped up, but just to say that in this project it became very important to be judicious about what we automated and what we didn't. We automated the big moves, but there were simply too many configurations, and we expect that each year they invent about 10 to 12 more different configurations. You simply can't automate for that. And so we automated the big moves, and the smaller moves are done through labor. Obviously, on a site like this, they can afford to put money into the labor. It's just a fact of the condition. And then in conclusion, and I talked about this idea of veiling it, there were a lot of things about the project that we had to accept and then turn into an advantage. And I talked about the veiling. The building is sitting up on that black pedestal. We designed that, but that's actually Port Authority infrastructure. Our lobby starts 21 feet up in the air by necessity. That wasn't a design decision. The cantilever, yes, we designed the cantilever, but that's because there was no bearing capacity anywhere farther south than where the cantilever is. So it was going to be a cantilever whether we wanted it to be a cantilever or not. But just to give some ideas about how you turn those pressures into advantages, a lot of the ideas that we ended up being able to put into the building use old methods, architectural methods, sometimes from church, synagogue, mosque architecture, for creating suspension of disbelief. So that idea of ascension. Thousands of years, architects have used ascension to create suspension of disbelief. Another is disorientation, right? So yes, when you're inside the building, you have no idea where you are. If you do that, you have to make sure that you have really big, dumb wayfinding so people know how to navigate. But the idea that they can't orient, that's another form that architects have used throughout time. Another is compression. So when you're in that perimeter, you're in about an 80-foot space that's 8 feet wide. Then you go through a sound and light lock that's super compressed. Again, you know this from like naves and other things in church cathedral architecture. And then you go into the chamber, and that release then creates this passage. So with that, now I will move on to the next concept, which we call flexible array. And at first I thought that we would only really find potential of this in the visual arts, and then we found actually a whole bunch of projects more recently where we're using it. So to explain it, I'll use a visual arts reference. This is a zinc plate of a printmaker. It's actually from Picasso. Picasso always felt uncomfortable working on a blank, either canvas or zinc plate. And most artists will do something to the white canvas, right? They will, in this case, he would put acid on it. A lot of artists will actually gesso their canvas with newspaper or other things, so that when they start to paint, they're working with something or against something that's already there. They're not just staring at a blank canvas. So imagine creating a museum on that same concept. So this is a museum for Edvard Munch in Oslo, Norway. Same idea I've already discussed, which is that white cube comes at a lot of Norwegian kroner in order to change it. So what if we gave them a pre-existing palette to work with and against, right? Uses far less intellectual and capital resources in order to create unique things. Very much the idea of the Noguchi playscape. And then the second idea was, how do we undo the problem of the classic museum that is a necklace of galleries where if you want to install or deinstall any portion of that necklace, you take the museum out of commission during that install and deinstall. So the proposal was, let's wrap the lobby around this flexible array. You're in the middle of an incredibly beautiful harbor fjord in Oslo. And so that led to this plan, which I think is one of the most beautiful plans we've developed. And each one of the galleries, this was during the competition, each one of the galleries then, because we weren't yet working with the museum, we made proposals for what they might be. This was a gallery from the Norwegian National Gallery. This is Munch's studios in Eckley. This is the Frick. This is any number of Frank Gehry galleries. This is the Neue National Gallery. This is any gallery in Chelsea. This is any number of Renzo Piano galleries, and this was our own gallery at the Guggenheim Las Vegas that had gotten torn out after about 5 years because of the Adelson family. Different part of the story, right? And you can see the result, that you have then this public walkway around all these galleries. You can see how unique each one of the galleries could potentially be. So what does that get you? You can have a museum that's one big show. It can be a museum that's 8 different shows. There's a great tradition in Scandinavian architecture that's best exemplified in the Louisiana Museum, which is, you have incredibly intense galleries, and then you have these beautiful vistas, almost like a palette cleanser, where you can create the Louisiana Museum within the system. But there was another advantage through forms of flexibility. The program was weird. Given the time of Munch's work, and there was another collection called the Stennerson that was really 19th century art, it was weird that they asked us to make a building that was, in terms of its galleries, 3/8 classical and 5/8 contemporary. It's odd if you're presenting Munch. And so through the forms, it looked like we were silly in the ones that we were picking, but by the ones that we picked to use in here, we could take 4 of those contemporary galleries and they can immediately transform into classical galleries. So you have a building that is basically can be 7/8 contemporary, or 5/8 contemporary, or 3/8 classical, or 7/8 classical. Right? The whole building can transform in terms of what its basic needs are, and a certain component of it could open up completely. This is the same size as the turbine hall at the Tate Modern, which has become another exemplar for gallery dimensions for a state-of-the-art museum. And there's the model. I just like the model. And I like the section. Okay, so how can we take that idea now and take it to a totally different direction? This is a project that we've been working on for a very long time. It's under construction. It is a $42,120 million residence on Long Island. And it was also done in a competition. When we started, we had no idea why we were invited, because the owner's requests in the competition were, I want it to be a residence for me, my 4 children, and their future families. I want it to be one structure. Still, we can do that too. I want a grand American stair. I don't know what that is. And the 4th thing is, I want it to look like it's always been there. And the other 4 architects are people you know who do architecture that looks like it's always been there. And we're like, why are we here? I mean, these are people who have made really illustrious careers out of doing some buildings in this city that are neoclassical. Some who might have been dean at Yale. So our proposal was this. We said, okay, we need one house that can be 5 houses. What does that mean? The site is extraordinary. It looks out into Long Island Sound. Frankly, the view in is more spectacular than the view out. It's an old growth forest. So we made what we called a necklace of different objects and residences. The parents were to be here. Oh, I really can't use this thing. So there's the parents' residence, and then there, on either side of them, there are family components. There's a huge amount that's below grade that I won't talk about, and then the 4 children's residences. And we made this necklace, and it sits at the promontory that's looking out over Long Island Sound, but it goes into the old growth forest. So it meets this ideal of a building that's both at the beach and in the forest, in the woods. There you see the site. It's 125 acres. It's pretty spectacular. And this is, you see what happens is the building starts to, as it goes inland, it starts to go as high in some areas, actually 35 feet off the ground. So you have spaces that, yes, the view out to Long Island sounds nice. It doesn't really change much, but going into the forest is really extraordinary. And this is where the idea of a flexible array came. And this is also where I thought we were going to lose the competition, because in the competition I said to him, your kids are never going to live with you. And he did not like that. It turns out, we've been doing this project for so long, I now have been vindicated. They're not going to live with it. And so our proposal is the antithesis of what he asked. He said, just basically block out 4 very simple houses for my children. We're like, if they're not going to live with you, you should actually make them wildly specific, so that the kids will either gravitate towards one or they'll timeshare. They'll say, hey, I want the barcode at Christmas, I want the dice house for Easter, and so forth. And if you know your American architectural mid-century modern house history, you'll be able to squint and see what 5 residences we were copying. And there you see the plan. And there was another idea baked into this. So it's got this secret garden, secret forest sitting in the center. But you see the typological differences of the 4 children's houses and his house. And you can see the crazy American stairs, which I'll show in a second. But it effectively was this, is that we argued, let me go back one quickly. We said, look, you don't want to be the world's greatest empty nester. So if we organize this, and around the perimeter of each one of these houses, there are these large rotating wood panels. They have the element at the far north, at the top of the screen. That's a space where the whole family can eat together. But if they're eating in each of their own dining rooms, they can keep these wood panels open. And in theory, the whole family can actually eat dinner together without being in the dining area. What that also means, though, if I go to the next image, is you can close them off. So when his children are not with him, the perception of the house is the residence, there's 2 communal sort of entertaining spaces, and a secret garden. So the fact that he is not with his children is not getting rubbed in his face. And then these are those crazy American stairs. And our thought here is, let's just take that wood wall that is so important to that notion of connectivity and blocking it off and so forth, and just sort of take our hand and like squeeze them into these really remarkably crazed objects. And there are 2 of them. They are the most structurally complex things we have ever designed. And this is them under fabrication in Germany. This is, for one of the stairs, this is one of 7 pieces. That's a second one of the pieces. And man, everything that you can say about German engineering and German refinement is dead on. These things are wildly precise. It's extraordinary what they've done with them. And then let's come to the final thing about making a building that looks like it has always been there. The building has a really nice architectural pun baked into it. I said to him point blank, I don't know how to do that. Even if you'd asked me to do it, I wouldn't know how to do it. So we basically took what I think is the greatest residence of all time, which is the Farnsworth House, and instead of doing a house that looks like it's always been there, we wrapped the detailing of the Farnsworth House in one-way mirror glass, and we said we're doing a house that looks like it has never been there. And that's the end result. The crazy thing about this is it had to go through a process of getting the city to approve it. And we assumed that this was going to be a nightmare process. And the city actually embraced the design because they said if it wasn't in mirror glass, its presence would be far, and we, to our credit, we have mock-ups. This one happens to be in Italy, but we took one and we put it out on the site and we let them come and drive boats around it and walk in the forest and everything. And it does, it kind of disappears. And so its mass disappears into the forest. That's an unusual kind of performance that I did not expect as a result, but it went through city planning. And that's it, under construction about 6 months ago. Okay, next one, kit of parts. This one is going to start with a story about McDonald's. We've been working with McDonald's for a long time, creating a highly prefabricated system. It sort of starts and stops depending on who's there and who's not there. But basically it was an idea in which if we could create a free-form design that could be tailored to a site. Right now, the way McDonald's picks sites, if they're looking for rectilinear sites that are very prescribed, where they can put their QSR box right on it. Right? So if we can actually make a restaurant that is free-form and can change to sites, what happens is not only does the building evolve while keeping a clear identity and always using the same kit of parts, but it means they can actually start using sites that were heretofore considered not viable. Right? So it opens up their whole real estate strategy in a whole different direction. So that was the idea of kit of parts. And we have applied it now into a very different situation. This is for a car company. They've asked us to create two, for lack of a better word, epicenter dealerships that are a combination of dealerships and cultural facilities and museums. And we were asked to do the first two sites. One is urban and one is quite rural, but the rural one is in a very, very affluent part of the country. And our argument was threefold. One is you need to do a thing that has clear identity, right? You want, and I didn't set it up properly. They're in the process of actually closing all of their dealerships nationwide, and they want to make 7 of these epicenter buildings, and we were asked to do the first 2. So we made the argument, you need to create something that has really clear identity. So it adjusts per site, but you know who it is. You know that it's got the DNA baked into it. This company also has, another core principle was, the life of a car, its design, is about 7 years. And what I mean by that is, if you look at Mercedes, if you look at Porsche, Porsche is probably a bad example because of certain, the 911 has never changed. But the Mercedes introduced that funny S-curve that was on the side, and it's basically now phased out of the car, right? Those things, those kind of elements that come and go, they have about a 7-year lifespan, and they overlap with other ones. But it's just to say that car design is evolving so rapidly, and particularly now, we have no idea what automation will be 10 years from now. Our argument was these buildings have to be basically 100% facade, and it has to be timeless. Basically, we need to make a frame. That's our charge. Make a frame and make it out of a kit of parts that are clearly identifiable, that are responsive to different sites, and that they engender also circulatory flexibility. And the company has 2 different brand mottos. One has to do with the overall, which is movement that inspires, and then a design motto that is opposites united. So the first idea was actually a facade idea, not even a spatial idea, was this, which is to create the holy grail of facades, which is a closed cavity facade. Closed cavity facade is a facade in which you pump pressurized air that is desiccated into an air cavity, so you don't ever have to worry about cleaning the air cavity. And you put a sacrificial laminated layer on the outboard, and you put an insulated layer on the interior, and you allow the cavity, you put something in the middle of it, as you just saw that in our case we're using a curtain, that's following the sun. Because it's following the sun, no matter where the sun is, the sun sees an opaque building. Any place that the sun is not can be completely transparent. That's why I say it's the Holy Grail. And using the technology and learnings, is that really a word? Learnings from the project I showed with the scalloped glass. We use scalloped glass in the outboard. That's much more scalloped. That's in order to have its stiffness, in order to resist wind load. Because we take the wind load out, with the exterior line of glass, the laminate. The interior insulated line doesn't have to be scalloped, it can just be subtly curved. And in both instances, we don't need to have any kind of mullion. And we don't really need coatings, right? So it is a wildly transparent building. So this is the one that's in the urban site, and you can see what happens to it. This, remember I said movement that inspires, so that now you're seeing how that idea is baked into the building. Opposites united. From our standpoint, the way this expresses that is you have this highly tectonic, man-made glass system that has a very kind of visceral, organic curtain that is moving on the interior, almost trapped within it. Actually, let me come back to this. And then there's a structural concept of an ABA structure, which then leans into this, and I'll show that, what I mean by that in a second. And in the process of these designs, we started to look at different spatial compartments that had the most potential different car layouts, and this was something spatially that we spent a lot of time with the company on. And then they become the basis, the kind of planning module, along with the facade for the whole project. And then the third idea was what we call the butterfly walls. That in all of the iterations that we explored, you can see how you can have one circulation around the central core, but the butterfly walls can also make rooms. So at any moment, the floor plate can be an entirely free plan, or it can be a series of very defined rooms. Now take all of those things and put them together, you get this. So this is that plan is defined as rooms, and then when the butterfly wall's closed and the curtains are up, you see that there's no structure, no mullions, no coatings. It seems like it's unreal. Another one of the spaces. And then just to show how this idea travels, this is the urban site, what happens when we take it and mash it onto the rural site. In this case now it's a two-story building, but all the components are identical. The dimension of the facade, the notion of the facade, the dimension of the planning module, and there you see it in the suburban rural environment. And the plan is one of the most, this one I think is the most beautiful, which is on the upper level. You see you can have this big open free plan that then can become highly, highly articulated. Okay, so I have one more, if I can do that quickly. One last idea. I wasn't sure if I'd get to it, so let me come back to these two slides in a second. The last one, I don't really know what to say about this one. I know that it's flexibility, we can articulate it less. I don't know yet that we have another project that falls into this category, and that's part of why I'm not sure I can describe it very well yet, is that it's not a recurring thing that has allowed us to dissect it properly. But it is a concept for an opera house in Shenzhen. I will say from the outset, we came in second. So it's one of the projects I'm most proud of. It's got the most beautiful section I think we've ever done, but we didn't win it. Jean Nouvel won after a year and a half and probably $1 million. Such is our profession. Well, first I have to tell you what's in an opera house. In the notion of an opera house is not just an opera. It has historically now become an opera, a multifunctional theater, a concert hall, an operetta. Right? That's the DNA of a, quote, contemporary opera house. And this DNA comes from what's weirdly, these buildings both started, or complexes both started construction in 1959. Bizarre, right? And from my perspective, I think that they defined the two potential strategies for how we've seen people approach the opera house typology. Unsurprisingly, I am more, not just because it's boxy, but I think it's doing something, is the strategy of Lincoln Center. So Lincoln Center, the idea, Wallace Harrison, who is the master planner, and then you have all these other architects who worked within it, he organized the gems within Lincoln Center. And the whole idea was to carve out public space out of the kind of unrelenting grid of Manhattan. That was the idea. And if you know Lincoln Center, I will tell you, as now having lived there for 25 years, it works. It's like, other than Central Park, it's the one place where you get these really great urban, but they're not parks, they're kind of collective spaces for performance. And he allowed then each one of the architects that worked within it to create their own, what's the right word? Begins with an M. Anyway, they each have their own kind of expressive mutation. So public space, but a kind of common language. And then the contrary to that, which frankly is the one that has taken hold, which is Sydney or Ulsan, which is to reorganize on the site and then to drape them on a super expensive, expressive blanket of iconography. That has nothing to do with the things underneath it. Comes at great expense, and that's it. And everyone goes, "Ooh, it's amazing architecture." You understand why, given everything I've said to date, why this doesn't turn me on. And as I said, Ulsan won. I can't think of a contemporary opera house that has not taken this strategy. These are some you may recognize. So our proposal, and I have to take a step back and say, in the competition, it was frankly a bit disappointing for two reasons. The first is they never spoke about the performance of the art. We counted at one point, the brief said icon 159 times. That was it. Make an icon, make an icon, make an icon. The second thing is that Shenzhen doesn't have a lot of open public space. And everything we just talked about with Lincoln Center, that's a real attraction. Like, how can we wrest urban public space out of a city that doesn't properly have it? So our idea might seem bonkers at first. It was to take these elements and stack them, thereby creating undeniably an icon and a big, I almost swore, sorry, a big urban space. I realized I took out some of the most interesting slides about this, but that's too bad. But I can say it in the last image. So there you see the net result. It is undeniably an icon. The question is this just too stupid to be realistic? Right? And I promise you that when we first presented it to the jury, and if there are students in the audience, I'll say, if you want to do something audacious, you have to come in armed for bear. You have to know exactly what their criticism is going to be in advance. And so the moment we started getting the questions we knew we were going to get, we said, oh, but wait, here's that answer. And then they'd say another thing, we're like, oh, but wait, here's this study. And you could see them start to get nervous because they started to realize this isn't as crazy as we thought. What do we do with this? So the first thing is just structurally that, you can't do that. That makes no sense. We organized it with this kind of megastructure in the center, and we hung the auditoria off of that megastructure. And that seems so harebrained until you realize that we did it in the Firth of Forth Bridge in 1885. And I tell you, when you're presenting to a municipality that's proud and you say, if they did it 150 years ago, you don't think you can do it? That's actually a pretty good argument. The second is that then we use that infrastructure to be, and this is where the idea of intensification comes from, a superhighway of circulation. That if you think of having 4 different elements on a site, each one might have 20 elevators on these big things. Well, now we have a singular building that can use all of those elevators aggregated into a single building. What that means is not only are the circulation times reasonable, but you can start sharing program. Right now, there's a huge amount of redundant spaces. If you look at Sydney or if you look at Lincoln Center, there's also a huge redundant amount of staff. In a building like this, you can cut out 30% of the changing rooms. You can cut out 30% of the rehearsal rooms. You can cut out 30% of the docents. You can cut out half of the box office and so forth. There's the section. As I said, I think it's the most beautiful section we've ever created. And then this is what we went in with, which they did not expect, was a full-on elevatoring analysis. And showing them that in a very, very conventional looking plan, let's just look at the numbers here. Before performance, the worst average waiting time during any 5-minute period, the worst one is 15 seconds. That's a pretty hard thing to argue against. And we did a systematic analysis using a Chinese programmer looking at basically how we could eliminate program. So we were also by far the smallest proposal of any of them. And we also had to make a proposal. We had to verify the design with a full-on cost estimate, and our cost estimate came in very favorably. So we were one of only 6 firms that went from the original 20 down to the final 6. And then we took that same idea of Lincoln Center, and each one of the different elements had its own, the word is on the tip of my tongue, motif, thank you, motif, whoever said motif. Each one has its own motif, and so I'll just show 2 of them. This is the opera, and you can see this motif. That motif is in these screens. It's also carried into the chandelier that's in the ceiling of the opera. This is the symphony. You see it has a different motif, also how it gets carried into the movable screens. This is one of the things I think is the most beautiful things we've designed, which is also the pipe organ that's in the ceiling. It's also the acoustic reflector on the ceiling. And then, yeah, the idea of these sort of crazed views from being on the 18th floor of an opera house. So with that, let me say one last thing, which is we freed up the ground plane. I took these images out, but we proposed on that ground plane to cover it with this Chinese grass that grows incredibly fast. And we showed them how then they could mow different kinds of organizations into the grass. So we had one that's a sculpture park, we had one that's a fairground, we had one that was just a long strip where they had a festival. Basically, the ground plane then also incorporated this idea of flexibility into the ground plane. All right, and so that's a good way to end, which is to come back to the original idea, which is Noguchi was super suspect of this. And can we, as architects, kind of let go of this high modernist notion of flexibility that, frankly, got developed by the Bauhaus, and we haven't done anything since the 1920s. Can we reconceive of flexibility as hyper-specificity? So thank you. 2 questions I went over.
Thank you, Joshua, for the insightful lecture. I was curious, you mentioned a lot between manual and automation. I'm curious how you structure your teams to really handle the duality of the two. And then also, too, on the client side, how do you elaborate costs and benefits of the investments into some of the moves that you make?
It's a great question, and you actually have to answer it in a bunch of different ways. The first is the best way to do a building that moves is to be 100% sure that it shouldn't move. I mean, I'm serious. And that kind of goes into the second thing, which is never want it more than your client. This is a really important thing, again, if there's students here. The best way to make sure an ambitious idea dies is if a client thinks that you want it for the sake of the idea. And they should kill it, frankly. And so on all of these projects, we go through a moment where we say, is the juice worth the squeeze? And we, in all these instances, worked with great clients who brought on great theater consultants and also great people who were doing cost exercises, not just the cost of the building, but also the operational cost, to understand if the operational cost was going to become a limiting concern. And on each one of them, we were super upfront with the owner of, okay, that date is the moment of no return. We all need to be on board by that date, or we need to pull the plug. And you need to mean it. You need to know in your heart that if you collectively can't get there, you need to know what the alternative is, because you will be dragging the client down, the 7th stages of hell. And even to the point, like on the project on the Perelman, we did that not just with the flexibility, we also did it with the facade. We actually presented in the competition, and this is a bit off topic, but it's the best example I can think of quickly. In the competition, we presented the stone and we presented an alternative. And in the competition, we also presented the procurement process, and we said, here's the battery of tests at this point, and here's the battery tests at this point, and if at any moment we fail, we need to revert to the other idea that was super interesting and ambitious, but was totally tried and true. And we meant it. And the fact that we meant it allowed the client to relax and to dream. And and I'm not telling this as a way of being manipulative, because it's not manipulation, it's being responsible to your owner. But what happens, to be honest, is when they know that you are protecting them, they will lean in. And really on the Perelman, every time we'd be like, and I should say, we also said we were going to carry that alternate design at our own cost, which we did. And every time we would say, okay, after we were presenting the stone and the development center, we're like, okay, let's talk about this other one. They're like, yeah, we don't want to talk about it. But that's actually an ideal scenario. So the way we deal with that was, one, not being seduced by movement, being absolutely sure at every step of the way how much movement was necessary, and stopping at that point, and also bringing on people who can evaluate the operational, economic, and not just in terms of time, but in manpower, but actually the economic implication of those things. But I will say a good example of the success of that was on the Wyly, which is the original iteration. We collectively weren't sure if the building should go to flat floor. And my memory serves, the cost to go to flat floor was ultimately about $500,000. That was our analysis. And I think we collectively made a really good decision, because the decision at that time was, that's a lot of money, but the advantage to this building to be able to have rental access for the rest of its life to go there will pay for itself in space. And the only way to know that, and to feel comfortable about that, was to bring all these other specialists who knew way more about operations than we did, in order to, I won't say verify, because that sounds like we knew it should work, to test it and come to a conclusion as to whether or not we should move forward or not. I think you had.
I thank you for your sharing your work. It's obviously extremely inspiring, and just as a thought of when you see the things that you guys come up with, starts as architecture, but it's also a machine, it's also infrastructure, it's almost becoming the performance itself. How do you see your work evolving, and do you want this to become sort of a blurred line between the building becoming the actual performance of what you're required to do as a project, or what is next into this kind of eliminating the boundaries between the program and the solution?
I think that these ideas of flexibility, yes. Movement, no. Because I'll repeat what I just said, which is, if you're in love with movement for movement's sake, you're going to really hurt your client. And so we really, before we ever go forward with doing anything that moves, we're really sure that it's the only good solution, that we can't achieve it in a different way. Yeah, I think that, I'm not sure I can actually say it any differently than that. You know, the movement of the facade in the project that I showed second to last, that is a holy grail. Right? I mean, have you ever been on the 7th floor of a building with no structures, no mullions, and no coatings? Nope. So it's going to make something that will make this brand stand out in a way that the world hasn't seen before. And we know that the technology behind it is sound, and again, that we won't lead them astray.